What happens when the most brilliant mind of an age refuses to bow to the very traditions that gave him power? He was a man who traded the heavy broadsword of his noble ancestors for the razor-sharp syllogism of the scholar. Yet he found the world of ideas far more bloodthirsty than any battlefield. Peter Abelard, who lived from 1079 to 1142, did not merely walk into the schools of the 12th century, he ignited them. He challenged every established authority, proving that in the hands of a genius, logic could be a weapon as lethal as any blade. But in an age where questioning the divine was a flirtation with damnation, the Rhinoceros of Gaul would soon discover that the higher one climbs on the ladder of reason. The more devastating the fall into the abyss of retribution. Peter Abelard stands as perhaps the most polarizing and brilliant figure of the 12th century Renaissance, a man whose life was defined by the relentless friction between unparalleled intellectual gift and devastating personal catastrophe. To understand Abelard is to understand the birth of the modern academic spirit within the rigid framework of medieval Christendom. He was the quintessential professional academic, a thinker who did not merely inhabit the schools of Paris, but fundamentally redefined their purpose and methodology. His legacy is not found in a quiet, contemplative monasticism, but in the noisy, competitive world of the early universities. Abelard pioneered scholasticism, a rigorous method that employed the tools of Aristotelian logic to dismantle and reconstruct Christian theology. In doing so, he shifted the foundation of belief from the passive acceptance of tradition to a vigorous, reasoned inquiry. Today, we explore a life that moved from the heights of intellectual dominance to the depths of physical and social exile, ultimately shaping the trajectory of Western thought for centuries to come. The intellectual landscape of the late 11th century was governed by a strict adherence to established masters. Peter Abelard, however, entered this world not as a disciple, but as a disruptor. His path to prominence was paved with the rejection of his social standing and the systematic dismantling of his mentors' reputations. Born in Le Palais, near Nantes, Abelard was the eldest son of a Breton knight. By the standards of his day, his destiny was clear. He was to inherit his father's lands, titles, and the martial responsibilities of the nobility. Yet, even in his youth, the allure of the clash of steel was eclipsed by the clash of wits. While residing in the court of the Dukes of Anjou at Loches, he encountered Roscelin of Compiègne, a provocative thinker known for his nominalist views. This encounter served as a catalyst for a radical departure from his heritage. Abelard formally renounced his inheritance, choosing instead the life of a wandering scholar. In his own mind, he traded the physical armor of a knight for the logical armor of a dialectician. He viewed the pursuit of philosophy as a more profound form of combat. Abelard's education was characterized by a restless mobility and a quickness of mind that frequently alienated his instructors. His tenure under William of Champeaux in Paris and Anselm of Laon provides a window into his methodology of rebellion. William was the champion of realism, the belief that universal concepts have a physical or substantive reality. Abelard, armed with a sharper grasp of logic, subjected William's theories to a public and devastating refutation. This was not merely a debate, it was a public execution of an established reputation that allowed Abelard to seize the intellectual high ground in Paris. When he later turned to theology under Anselm of Laon, the pattern repeated. To Abelard, Anselm's fame was built on empty rhetoric rather than substantive insight. He famously compared Anselm to a fire that filled a house with smoke rather than light, noting that the master was useless when put to the question. To prove that theological understanding did not require years of stultified apprenticeship, Abelard accepted a challenge to expound upon the complex book of Ezekiel with almost no preparation. His success was a direct assault on the traditional guild-like structure of medieval education, asserting that individual genius and logical rigor were superior to long years of traditionalist study. By 1114, Abelard had ascended to the pinnacle of the academic world, becoming the head of the school at Notre Dame. His lectures became a cultural phenomenon, attracting an estimated 5,000 students to Paris. This huge and novel concourse included future popes, dozens of cardinals, and the most influential scholars of the next generation. Abelard's appeal lay in his synthesis of scholarship and showmanship. He was not a dry lecturer, he was a popular entertainer who sang his own compositions in Parisian taverns in the evenings. His students affectionately and perhaps fearfully dubbed him the Socrates of Gaul and the Rhinoceros Indomitus, the untamable rhinoceros. The latter title aptly captured his intellectual persona, thick-skinned, aggressive, and impossible to steer once he had set his sights on an opponent's logical weakness. Abelard's success was inseparable from his staggering self-assurance. In his later autobiographical work, Historia Calamitatum, he admits that he came to believe he was the only philosopher remaining in the world. This was more than mere vanity. It was a fundamental component of his brand. He built his authority by intellectually crushing those who represented the status quo. This period of his life represents the ultimate triumph of the individual over the institution. He taught with no formal qualifications other than his own evident mastery. However, this meteoric rise created a precarious foundation. By humiliating his masters and mocking the traditionalists, he was not only building a school of devoted followers, but also an army of influential enemies. They waited for the moment his untamable nature would lead him into a vulnerability they could exploit. As Abelard himself later reflected, his pride had weakened his spiritual resolution, setting the stage for a transition from intellectual combat to personal tragedy. The trajectory of Abelard's life took a tectonic shift when his intellectual dominance was superseded by a scandalous and violent personal crisis. This period represents a transition from the Rhinoceros Indomitus of the lecture halls to a man broken by the very social structures he had previously mocked. By roughly 1115, at the age of 35, Abelard reached a state of worldly success that, by his own admission, bred a dangerous complacency. He noted that worldly security weakens the spirit's resolution, and it was in this state of prideful vulnerability that he encountered Héloïse. She was the niece of Fulbert, a canon at the Cathedral of Paris, and was likely under the age of 20. Abelard's pursuit of Héloïse was characterized by the same tactical precision he applied to logic. He engineered a living arrangement by suggesting to Fulbert that he take his meals in their home, eventually securing a position as her tutor. The result was an intense affair where, as Abelard famously described, kisses were more numerous than sentences. The relationship resulted in a secret pregnancy and the birth of a son, Peter Astrolabus, in Brittany. To appease Fulbert, the couple entered into a secret marriage. Though Héloïse resisted this because she understood that as a married man, Abelard's career as a prominent theologian would be effectively terminated. The secrecy of the marriage was short-lived. When Fulbert went public with the news, Héloïse vehemently denied it to protect Abelard's professional standing. Enraged by what he perceived as further deception and the potential ruin of his niece's reputation, Fulbert orchestrated a barbaric revenge. In a nighttime surprise attack, hired knights castrated Abelard. This act was more than a physical assault. It was a symbolic destruction of his identity. In the medieval view, such a mutilation carried profound social and canonical consequences, often barring a man from certain ecclesiastical positions. Devastated and viewing the event as a divine punishment for his sin of pride, Abelard sought refuge in the monastery of Saint-Denis. Simultaneously, he compelled Héloïse to take the veil as a nun, effectively ending their physical union. Though their romantic life was severed, the intellectual bond between Abelard and Héloïse endured through a remarkable correspondence. This exchange revealed Héloïse not merely as a former lover, but as a formidable intellectual equal who often surpassed Abelard in personal integrity and disinterested love. Around 1130, Abelard established an oratory named the Paraclete near Troyes. He eventually installed Héloïse there, where she became a highly competent abbess, governing a community that became a center for education and liturgical innovation. The Paraclete became a repository for Abelard's sermons and hymns, many written at Héloïse's request. It was also Héloïse who prompted the writing of his autobiography, the Historia Calamitatum, and pushed him to address complex scriptural issues in the Problemata Heloici. Their relationship evolved into a union of minds, inspired by Ciceronian ideals of friendship, marking a shift from carnal passion to a shared intellectual mission. Following his entry into the monastery, Abelard did not retreat into silence. Instead, he applied his dialectical mastery to the very heart of Christian doctrine. This sparked a firestorm of controversy that would dog him for the rest of his life. Abelard's primary contribution to the burgeoning field of scholasticism was the formalization of a method that placed human reason as the primary tool for understanding divine revelation. His motto, "I understand so that I might believe," directly inverted the traditional Augustinian priority of faith over understanding. His most influential work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, exemplified this approach. In it, he juxtaposed 158 theological propositions with conflicting quotes from Scripture and the Church Fathers. Rather than resolving these contradictions for the reader, Abelard left them open to stimulate critical inquiry. He argued that through doubting we come to inquiry, and through inquiry we perceive the truth. This was a revolutionary stance. He was suggesting that the apparent disagreements in holy texts were not flaws to be ignored, but puzzles to be solved through logic. Abelard's attempt to apply these logical tools to the nature of the Trinity proved particularly dangerous. In his Theologia Summi Boni, he used analogies derived from human reason to explain the Godhead. His opponents, led by the nominalist Roscelin, accused him of heresy. They argued that Abelard's focus on the individual members of the Trinity made the one God appear to be a mere abstraction. They were scandalized by his implication that human reason could fully grasp the divine mystery. In 1121, at the Council of Soissons, Abelard was condemned without a proper hearing. He was forced to publicly burn his book and recite the Athanasian Creed in tears, a profound humiliation for a man who believed the truth could always be defended through debate. Abelard also challenged the prevailing views of the atonement. He rejected the popular ransom to Satan theory and Anselm's satisfaction theory, which viewed Christ's death as a necessary payment for sin. Instead, he proposed what is now known as the moral influence theory. Abelard argued that God's forgiveness was an act of pure grace. The primary purpose of the incarnation was to provide a crown act of love that would awaken a reciprocal love in humanity. To Abelard, the cross was not a legal transaction, but a pedagogical and emotional demonstration intended to win the human heart back to God. While this emphasized God's character as love, critics saw it as a dangerous subjective turn that undermined the objective necessity of Christ's sacrifice. In his work Scidote Ipsum, Abelard further disrupted traditional thought by centering morality on the internal state of the individual. He argued that sin does not reside in the external act itself, but in the contempt for the wishes of God found in the intention. For Abelard, an action could be good or bad, depending entirely on the motive of the actor. This focus on the subjective element of morality was a precursor to modern ethical thought. In the 12th century, it was viewed as another example of Abelard's tendency to elevate the individual mind over established tradition. But this elevation of the individual would soon bring him face to face with the most powerful defender of the collective tradition. The aftermath of Abelard's physical trauma did not usher in a period of quiet contemplation. Rather, his entry into the monastic life was marked by a fundamental inability to reconcile his fierce intellectual independence with the requisite vow of obedience. This era of his life illustrates a man perpetually at odds with the institutions designed to provide him sanctuary. Abelard's tenure at the Royal Abbey of St. Denis was characterized by immediate and sharp discord. True to his provocative nature, he applied his critical historical methods to the monastery's own foundation myths. By questioning the legend of Dionysius, the patron saint of the abbey, he effectively alienated his brothers and the powerful political figures connected to the site, forcing him to flee in search of safety. His subsequent appointment as the abbot of St. Gildas de Rui in Brittany proved even more disastrous. Here, Abelard found himself attempting to reform a community of monks he described as lawless and even murderous. The mismatch between the sophisticated Parisian academic and the rugged monks of the Breton coast was absolute. This period highlighted the central paradox of Abelard's character. While he frequently extolled the theoretical virtues of the monastic vocation, he was temperamentally unsuited for the practicalities of submission. By 1136, Abelard sought to return to his true element, the competitive intellectual environment of Paris. Instead of reintegrating into the cathedral school of Notre Dame, he established a private school on Mont Sainte-Geneviève. This move was strategically significant. By operating independently of the cathedral's direct oversight, he could lecture without the traditional restrictions usually placed on authorized masters. His return was a resounding success. His reputation had remained remarkably intact despite his personal scandals and unstable monastic career. Students once again flocked to him, including the most brilliant minds of the next generation, such as John of Salisbury and the future Pope Celestine II. This final Parisian period solidified his legacy as a teacher who could not be silenced, yet it also signaled to his detractors that his influence was expanding beyond their control. The final great crisis of Abelard's life was not a private tragedy, but a public collision between two irreconcilable worldviews. The struggle between Peter Abelard and Bernard of Clairvaux remains the definitive symbol of the tension between the old and new ways of medieval Christian thought. Bernard of Clairvaux represented the traditional monastic education. For him, truth was found in the prayerful, contemplative reading of Scripture and a strict loyalty to the traditions of the Church Fathers. He viewed the application of dialectical logic to divine mysteries as a form of intellectual sacrilege. Peter Abelard represented the burgeoning scholastic movement. He championed the curiosity and investigative power of logic as a tool to serve and clarify faith. Alarmed by the widespread influence of Abelard's views and his perceived arrogance, Bernard initiated a campaign of denunciation. He privately warned Abelard first, but when met with defiance, he brought the matter before the bishops of France. Abelard, perhaps overestimating the power of his own logic to win over a hostile audience, requested a public council to debate the points in dispute. The Council of Sens in 1141, however, was not the intellectual tournament Abelard envisioned. On the eve of the council, Bernard met privately with the bishops to pre-select and condemn specific propositions from Abelard's writings. Realizing the proceedings were rigged against him, Abelard refused to defend himself when the council convened the following morning. In a final act of institutional defiance, he announced his intention to appeal directly to the Pope in Rome. The formal errors charged against Abelard at Sens were extensive. The Trinitarian error included accusations that his logical analogies divided the unity of God. There were suggestions of Nestorianism regarding the nature of Jesus and the charge of soteriological subjectivity, that he transformed the atonement into a mere lesson in charity. Criticism of his ethics claimed his focus on intention neglected the objective reality of moral law. Bernard's victory was swift. He wrote to the Roman Curia, and before Abelard could reach Rome, Pope Innocent II confirmed the council's sentence. Abelard was condemned as a heretic and sentenced to perpetual silence. The storm of Abelard's life finally subsided not through a legal victory, but through the compassionate intervention of a peer. While traveling toward Rome to press his appeal, a physically weakened Abelard stopped at the great abbey of Cluny. The abbot, Peter the Venerable, recognized the tragedy of the situation. He interceded with the Pope to mitigate the sentence and remarkably managed to broker a formal reconciliation between Abelard and Bernard of Clairvaux. At Cluny, Abelard finally found the peace which he had elsewhere sought in vain. He donned the habit of a Cluniac monk and spent his final years as a humble teacher within the monastery school. His combative spirit softened. In his final dialogues, he displayed a sympathy for his interlocutors that was notably absent in his youth. Peter Abelard died on April 21st, 1142. Upon his death, Peter the Venerable performed a final act of kindness by sending Abelard's body to Héloïse at the Paraclete. When Héloïse died decades later, she was buried beside him. Their remains now rest together in Paris, a lasting monument to a partnership that survived both physical violence and ecclesiastical condemnation. The significance of Peter Abelard transcends the dramatic narrative of his life. It resides in the fundamental shifts he precipitated in the Western intellectual tradition. The Abelardian spirit became the bedrock upon which the great universities of Europe were built. Abelard's most enduring contribution was the refinement of the scholastic method. By insisting that logic was the necessary handmaid to theology, he provided the tools that allowed the medieval mind to move beyond the mere repetition of authority. His emphasis on linguistic precision and the resolution of contradictions paved the way for the systematic syntheses of the 13th century. Without Abelard's sic et non, it is difficult to imagine the structure of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologiae. In the realm of philosophy, Abelard provided a sophisticated middle ground in the battle over universals. He proposed what is often termed conceptualism, arguing that universal terms are mental concepts derived from individual things. This shift allowed for a more nuanced understanding of how human language and thought relate to the objective world, a development that anticipated modern epistemology. Abelard was a precursor to the modern emphasis on the individual. His focus on intention as the locus of morality shifted the ethical gaze from the external act to the internal conscience. Similarly, his correspondence with Héloïse stands as a landmark in the history of human relationships, documenting a transition to a partnership defined by shared intellectual labor and mutual respect. Ultimately, Peter Abelard's life illustrates the how and why of the transition from the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages. His story is one of profound irony. The man who was silenced by the church became the teacher of the church's greatest thinkers. He was a figure who suffered for his arrogance, yet his insistence that God is the author of both reason and revelation ensured that faith and intellect would remain in a dynamic dialogue. Abelard did not just teach his students what to think, he taught the Western world how to think. Peter Abelard's life forces us to ask, is faith more authentic when it is protected from inquiry or when it is forged in the fires of logic? As you reflect on his journey, consider whether our modern pursuit of truth requires the same untamable courage that Abelard displayed. Join our community of thinkers as we unpack the how and why behind the faith right here on this channel. Join us tomorrow as we fast forward 2 centuries to meet John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation, and explore how another academic giant dared to put the Word of God into the hands of the common man.